In this video, Jordan Peterson talks about how personality development starts early in life.
If you're going to be a good person, you can decompose being a good person into sub-parts of being a good person, and you can decompose, so being a good person is an abstract ideal, but as you move closer and closer to the point where the goodness is manifested in action, you move closer and closer to actual movements in the world. And so the abstract category, good person, is actually made out of, you can think about it as a very complex melody of motor actions and perceptions. Perception is very tightly linked to motor action because whenever you perceive anything, you're doing it in part by actively investigating the world. It's partly why your eyes are moving around all the time, and if you're listening, you move your head, and to touch something you have to actively investigate it. So it's always an activity of exploration. Now, in some ways, when you think about the child piecing its being together from the bottom up, you can think about that as a biological process unfolding. And you could think of the child as crawling and then learning to walk as a biological process unfolding. But that's an oversimplification because human beings exist from day one in a very, very social world. And so what that means is the way that those behaviors or sub-micro-personalities start to organize themselves is always under the influence of the society in which they're embedded. And so, Piaget talked about the child as being as having basic built-in reflexes at birth. And that those reflexes are then elaborated up into more and more complex structures. But you can think that even the elaboration of those basic reflexes, even right from the beginning, like there's a rooting and sucking reflex, which you can elicit from a child by tapping on the side of its cheek when it's very newly born, and it'll search to try to put what's tapping in its mouth. And that's part of the reflexive process, the built-in perceptual motor unit that allows the child to begin to suckle. Now the thing is, though, what it's suckling isn't a static and objective entity, it's a person. And part of breastfeeding is the establishment of a relationship, a complex relationship, because it's also not only a feeding relationship, it's a caring relationship, it's a relationship that's based on tactile interaction. There can be nervousness associated with it, and often is, especially for a new mother. It's a very complex, dynamic social act, and so what that means is that right from the beginning, in order for the baby to engage in that process properly, it has to allow its initial reflexive movements to be modified by social necessity immediately. So, for example, if a baby is breastfeeding, it can't bite. And, it doesn't have any teeth, so being bitten isn't necessarily a catastrophe, but it's not pleasant. And so what will happen if the baby bites the mother is that the mother will pull away and startle the baby, and then the baby will cry, and the mother will be at least startled by the error, and so the baby has to learn to be civilized in some sense right off the bat. Now, when Freud was talking about the process of socialization, he tended to concentrate more on toilet training, because he thought of that as the first place where the first major place where the id of the child, which Rogers would regard as the organismic experiential domain, is brought under control of the superego, right? Because the baby, obviously, its fundamental biological function is to relieve itself, but that has to come under very, very strict social control. And it's a complex form of learning. It's basically the acquisition of voluntary control over what was heretofore an involuntary reflex, essentially. And so that can go well or it can go badly, and it can go very badly. So I knew a family who had a daughter at one point, and that daughter would only defecate in her diaper when she was 3. So that meant she had full voluntary control of her bowel function, but there was no way she was going to participate in the social ritual that surrounded proper toileting. There was a war going on, like a serious war, and that sort of thing happens, well, not infrequently. And of course, you remember in the Crumb movie, the mother, the boys accusing the mother of giving them enemas, and her, of course, denying that any such thing happened, which was something that made both of them roll their eyes. You know, and they all laughed, but it's really not particularly amusing. So, anyways, my point is that even at the micro level, the manifestation of what we'll call micro-personalities expands and organizes into an environment that's conditioned by social expectation. Okay, so then, and this is something we haven't talked about before, one thing you might ask is, okay, where does the social expectation come from? Now, that's a very complex question because in some sense that's the same question as where does culture come from? And that's partly a complex question because you have to take into account evolutionary history, which provides the substrata for the development of culture, so that would be human biology, you have to take that into account, and then you have to take human history into account, and where what you don't have to take into account is not clear, right? Because it's very difficult to track the origins of the social routines that make up the fundamental social contract. You know, we know how to behave properly, roughly speaking. We have a set of expectations and a set of wants about the way that other people are going to behave with regards to us, and they return the favor. And everyone is participating in this, and everybody basically knows it, unless they're very poorly socialized, and you can usually tell that right away. You know, kids can tell that, because if a 3-year-old is playing with another 3-year-old, and one of them is poorly socialized, and so maybe has the behavioral repertoire of a fairly badly behaved 2-year-old, the other 3-year-old, being socially sophisticated, will say, will not play with the first one. So, even though they might be perfectly happy to play for a time with an actual 2-year-old. So, it doesn't take very long. It's really at about the age of 3 that children are already sophisticated enough to have embodied the rules that constitute appropriate cultural behavior.